And let me introduce David. We're so happy to have David here today. As you know, David was born and raised in Mexico City to American parents. And he was a fellow ASFer, as many of us are. He has worked for the Wall Street Journal for 20 years based in Mexico. And he is currently the editor for Latin America, responsible for coverage from Mexico to Argentina, and the Caribbean. He has covered a variety of issues from financial crisis in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina to peace negotiations in Northern Ireland in the late 1990s to the Iraq War in 2003 and the Tahrir Square uprising in 2011, among others. And today, David will be speaking about the American dream and what the opportunity of the American dream and what Mexico could do to possibly do the same. So David will speak for a few minutes, and then he has kindly offered and suggested to open up to questions so it can be more of a discussion. So with that said, I'd like to ask everyone if you could possibly mute your mic, and we'll listen to David. And when David is ready for questions, we'll have a discussion. So David, if there anything else you need from us, if not, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Patty Hogan for getting us in touch with David as well. And this is a real pleasure. So welcome everyone.
Thanks, Aliki, and thanks to Patty as well. I was working on my presentation this morning and it's got a bit longer than I initially expected. But I really do want to leave some time for questions and answers because that's always the most interesting and dynamic part. And I'm glad we were talking about history because the older I get, I've become something of a history nerd. So I think a lot of history teaches us a lot. So I do want to talk a bit about history today. As you mentioned, I was born in Mexico to American parents, and I've always thought one of the great things about that is that living and working outside your native land gives you perspective. So I've always felt that being an American growing up in Mexico gave me perspective on both countries. Now I'm a big believer in perspective. One of my favorite anecdotes involves the time when a group of Mexican businessmen traveled to Israel in the mid-1990s to meet with then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, whom most of you probably remember was assassinated by a hardline Israeli for trying to make peace with the Palestinians. Anyhow, over dinner, the Mexicans told him the famous Porfirio Díaz saying, "Pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca los Estados Unidos." And there was, of course, some truth to this. The US took more than half of Mexico's land in the War of 1847, which we all know. But when the Israeli prime minister heard the joke, he broke out laughing and said, "I'd put it somewhat differently. Poor Israel, so far from the United States and so close to God." And I love that because he's also right. The best thing that ever happened to Mexico was being next to the world's greatest economy, a reality Mexico ignored until former President Carlos Salinas suddenly realized, why do we treat the US as our biggest threat when it's our biggest opportunity? So my hope today is that we can talk a little bit about some of the things I've seen in Latin America over the past 30 years that can give us some perspective on the region and a bit of insight into what's happening elsewhere in the world, particularly in the US. Now, over much of my career as a journalist, I've walked away with a deeper admiration of what Europe and the US managed to achieve in building stable and prosperous societies. Because of its success, I used to think the US didn't have that much to learn from Latin America. But over the past few years, I've started to see some parallels between events in the US and Latin America. And I worry that we're starting to repeat some of Latin America's mistakes. One of the great questions that journalists and academics and historians and others try to answer is, why do some parts of the world develop faster than others? There are a lot of great books on this, like Guns, Germs, and Steel, and Why Nations Fail. And the answer involves all kinds of things, including things like rainfall and geography. I once met a very well-traveled man, I think he was a spy, who drew a country in the shape of sort of a glass or a cup. This, he said, could be Mexico without Baja California and the Yucatan. And he drew mountains all along here and all along here and all along here. And he said, that's Mexico, that's Colombia, and that's Afghanistan. All three countries have lots of mountains. They're all poor and they all struggle with regional violence. Why? Because it's hard to get around mountains. So there's less communication and exchange of ideas, more isolation. Mexico has tens of thousands of hamlets of 100 or fewer people, about 100 times more than in the US. Bringing electricity and roads to these places is expensive. You need tunnels and bridges, and that costs a lot of money. It's no coincidence that the poorest part of the United States remains Appalachia. So there are a lot of reasons why Latin America has lagged the US and Europe, but today I want to talk about four in particular, and four central reasons why the American dream never became the Latin American dream. They all start with the letter I: inequality, institutions, impunity, and insecurity, and all these I's affect each other. So let's start with inequality. Every journalist and every visitor who comes to the region, and we've all noticed this, notices the difference between rich and poor. The great German naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt, described Mexico as the country of inequality. And sadly, not much has changed. In Mexico, the top 1% control nearly half the country's wealth. In the US, the top 1% now controls about 35%, up from 25% 20 years ago. The bottom half in both countries control less than 2% of accumulated wealth, the bottom half. In 2005, the Wall Street Journal was publishing a series of stories on growing inequality in America and the challenges that posed to the American dream. It was becoming ever more difficult for Americans to deliver what the country had always promised, that children would do better than their parents. As I read the series, I called up my editors and said, boy, you guys are complaining about inequality in the US. You should get a load of Latin America. So to do the story, we decided to focus on a single town in the state of Puebla called Tehuacan. You have been in Mexico for a while, will know that Tehuacan is where the famous mineral water comes from. It's a city that should be a pretty prosperous city. It has Mexico's second biggest chicken producer and the big bottled water business. So I visited a middle school in a poor district outside Tehuacan. I wanted to know more about the kids and how they saw their lives. So I asked them, what do you guys want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do with your life? And they all just sat in silence. I realized that no one had ever really asked them that question before. So I said, well, come on, you guys must have thought of something. I mean, do you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, a soccer player, an astronaut? But again, there was silence. So I said, okay, let's try something different. What do your parents do? And it turned out every kid in the class had a parent that either worked as campesinos or laborers in construction. I said, okay, well, do you want to do what your parents do? No, they all shouted in unison. Okay, well then what do you want to do? Again, there was silence. Finally, a little girl raised her hand. Yes, I asked eagerly, go to the US. And at first I was a little confused. I said, well, go to the US, that's not a career choice. And she said, yes, it is, because if you go there, you can do what you want to do. And here you really can't. So I said, okay, how many of you want to go to the US? Every single hand went up except for one boy. His dad had already gone to El Norte and he didn't like it. He wasn't treated well and he didn't like the cold, so he came back. But think about it. For most of these kids, they didn't see themselves as having any control over their lives. For them, choosing a career really meant going to the US. And the sad truth is, for most of them, becoming an astronaut is simply an impossible dream. So how did Latin America become so unequal? And like most things, the short answer is history. It's easy to forget that it's going to be another 80 years in the future until Latin American countries will have been independent nations as long as they were colonies for Spain and Portugal. Sorry, I'm viewing Steve Rosenberg's screen.
1 second, sorry, David. Steve Rosenberg, you need to stop sharing your screen. Sorry, I had allowed everyone to thinking that you were going to. All right, sorry.
I will share a screen at one point.
You know what? When you're going to do that, let me know, and I will let you share it. I'll make you a co-host. Sorry about the interruption. Go ahead. Sorry, David.
No, that's okay. So, basically, Latin America were colonies of England, of Spain and Portugal for 300 years. That's an awfully long time. Now, when the Spanish explorers discovered places like Mexico and Peru, they felt they had hit the jackpot. They found a land rich in natural resources like gold and silver, and an indigenous population they could force to work virtually for free. The colonies were not a place to settle so much as to exploit. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever given much thought about why the British colonies in the Americas ended up being so different from Spanish and Portuguese colonies. It has very little to do with different culture or religion, and it was largely an accident of history and geography. In the great age of exploration and discovery in the 1500s, Britain wasn't a big enough world power to rival the Spanish and Portuguese empires, so it relied on pirates to basically steal their gold. But by the early 1600s, after the great Queen Elizabeth and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Britain was on the rise. But what was left in the New World to take over? The answer are the leftovers that no one else wanted, the colder bits that were less productive because they produced fewer natural resources. What the British wanted in a colony is exactly what the Spanish and Portuguese had: gold and other riches that they could exploit using a subdued native population. In this book, Why Nations Fail, there's a great description of the first settlement in Jamestown by the Virginia Company. The business model was the exact same one pioneered by Cortez and Pizarro: capture the local Indian chieftain and force the remaining Indians to provide food and free labor to exploit the gold. One colonist wrote, quote, "There was no talk, no hope, no work, but dig gold, refine gold, load gold." After a while, it dawned on Captain John Smith that this business model wasn't going to work. There was no gold, and far fewer Indians than in places like Mexico or Peru. What's more, the ones that were there were pretty hostile and wary of outsiders. Maybe by that time they had heard what had happened to Montezuma. John Smith, by the way, is one of history's great larger-than-life characters. He was born in Lincolnshire, England, and ignored his dad's advice to go into business and set out instead to become a mercenary, a soldier of fortune. He ended up fighting for the Austrian Empire against the invading Ottoman Turks. He was captured and turned into a slave before 1 year overcoming his master and escaping back to Austria. He eventually joined the expedition to Jamestown. He was so unruly on the trip over that the masters of the expedition decided they were going to put him on trial the moment they arrived. But when they arrived, they opened their letters from the Virginia Company, and to their horror, they read that John Smith was to be included in the governing council, so they couldn't very well put him on trial. Anyhow, John Smith realized that if they were going to survive, they wouldn't simply be able to get the Indians to work for them and give them food. So he wrote back to the Virginia Company and said the get-rich-quick scheme wasn't going to work. If the colony was going to survive, it would have to do the work for itself. So he employed to send no more goldsmiths, but wrote, quote, 30 carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, blacksmiths, masons, and diggers up of trees and roots would be far better rather than 1,000 more of what we have. The Virginia Company didn't listen. In the winter of 1609-1610, only 60 of the 500 colonists survived. The Virginia Company then hit upon a new scheme. If it couldn't find the Indians to exploit, it would exploit the colonists. So it shipped over a bunch more, including carpenters this time, and essentially turned them into indentured servants. They were to work entirely for the company. Any person caught stealing anything produced by the colony for their own profit would be put to death. That's right, the death penalty. Oh, and escaping to the Indians was also punishable by death. Well, unsurprisingly, this didn't work either. And it took until 1618, some 10 years after the colony began, for the Virginia Company to change its approach. This time, it guaranteed that each settler would be given 50 acres and 50 acres more for each family member. They were freed from their contracts, given houses, and allowed to have an elected assembly where leading men would take decisions over local matters. That was the beginning of American democracy. This never happened in Latin America. In places like Brazil and Cuba, and eventually in the southern US, The soil and climate lent themselves to cultivating cash crops like sugar, cotton, and coffee that were all high value and attracted huge investments, turning them into vast estates. That concentrated landholding into few hands. By the 1960s, just 2% of landowners in Guatemala owned 80% of the land, and they needed cheap labor to work those estates. Many of these places in Latin America had large native populations. Places that didn't, like Brazil and the southern US, imported slaves. Brazil, which imported 4 million slaves, was the last country to ban slavery in 1888, not many years after our country fought a bloody civil war over the same issue. By contrast, in Canada and the northern British colonies in the US, climate favored a mixture of crops and livestock with no great economies of scale. Small farmers became the norm, less demand for slaves and cheap labor, and a culture of fair rules that helped everyone. A resource-based economy promotes a culture based on who you know instead of what you know. How do you get a mining concession? It surely helped to know somebody in the Spanish royal court. If your economic relationships are based more on who you know rather than what you know, then hard work and entrepreneurship suffers. If you're going to inherit daddy's company, why work hard or take risks? Education also gets less emphasis. Only a few years after its founding in the early 1600s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony made primary school education mandatory. It took Brazil until the mid-1960s. Today, a majority of Latin Americans still don't graduate from high school. Now, I've been banging on about inequality. Who cares? Well, in one way we shouldn't. We don't want an equal society. We want to reward those who work harder and those who take risks to build wealth. As an outcome, we want an unequal society. But every society that calls itself just should focus on another kind of equality, equality of opportunity. How do we as a society make sure that everyone gets a shot? And here's the thing, once inequality gets too big, it starts to create inequality of opportunity. And it starts to affect what economists call social and economic mobility, the ability of the poor to climb the economic ladder through hard work. When he first visited the US, French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville noticed that the US was a far more unequal place than Europe. But he said Americans tolerated this because of social and economic mobility, the belief that if you work hard, you could climb the ladder. Not so in Mexico. If you grow up poor in Mexico even today, you only have a 10% shot at making the middle class. In the US, your chances are 30%. That number in the US, by the way, is slowly but surely shrinking. So what happens when a kid can't achieve their dreams? Why should we care about economic mobility? Who cares if the poor can't become rich? Well, once that starts to happen, all kinds of stuff starts to go wrong. For starters, economic growth suffers. Why? Easy. If the poor can't get wealthy through hard work, why work that hard? If you're wealthy already and can simply keep all your money and pass it on from generation to generation, why work hard and take risks? That means if the US keeps getting more unequal, there's a good chance your grandchildren will be less well off than they would have been in a fairer society. In 1980, Mexico's economy was nearly 4 times the size of South Korea. At the time, South Korea targeted exports for growth and made sure nearly all of its citizens finished college and had broadband. Now, South Korea's economy is about 20% bigger than that of Mexico. One thing we found time and again in Tehuacan and elsewhere is that most people in Latin America do what their parents did for a living. The daughter of the woman who grinds tortillas dropped out of middle school so she could work alongside her mother. Why stay in school if you can't live your dream? You might as well start working. Similarly, the sons and daughters of all the richest families in Tehuacan all went to elite private schools with the expectations that they would take over daddy's company. The upshot is you end up with a society that's less entrepreneurial. If Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg had done what their parents did, we'd all be poorer for it. Now, another side effect of inequality is what I call the junior effect. And here's where I'll start to share my screen, Aliki. A junior is a daddy's boy who, as the old saying goes, was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple. You see them all over Latin America, the sons and daughters of the elite, hair slicked back, driving a Ferrari and spending obscene amounts of money. Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook are full of pictures of these people traveling the world. I'll get my screen shared now because I want to show you guys this. This was Mexico's highest grossing film of all time, Nosotros los Nobles. I hope you saw it. I hope you can see the clip.
Not yet.
Miami, here we go.
Ellos son los nobles. El mi rey.
Les presento a la Cuba más grande del mundo.
El hipster.
Carlos, no puedes estarme acosando en la escuela.
Y la princesa.
Les tengo una noticia huge. Nos vamos a casar.
No conocen límites.
Bueno, ¿tú has visto esto? Los estados de cuenta de mis hijos. Necesitan mano dura esos niños.
Pero están por recibir una lección.
Cancelaron mi Black. Y mi Black. Cancelaron todo.
¿Me puedes explicar por qué nos están quitando todo como si estuviéramos en Venezuela?
Porque descubrieron un fraude.
¿Y si nos entregamos?
Ahora tendrán que conseguir lo que nunca han tenido. Trabajo.
Si me pasan su pasaje, porfa.
Sin lujos.
O sea, no voy a salir así vestida de zorra.
Sin ayuda. Y sin tarjetas de crédito.
¿Qué es eso?
El pecero de Lucho es pirata, pa.
Esto no es por la de los Pumas, así que córtate el cabello.
Pero eso
Anyway, you guys get the idea. China has them too. I'll stop sharing now. China has them too, the princelings. Africa has them, so does Saudi Arabia. And I've started to see more of them in the US for the first time. Our politics is starting to become family business, whether it's the Clintons or the Bushes or the Trumps. I saw a story about Chelsea Clinton earning $9 million by sitting on the board of an internet company. Hunter Biden's son made good money sitting on the board of a Ukrainian energy company while his dad was vice president. And of course, we now have sons and daughters and sons-in-law roaming the White House by virtue of their birth certificates and who they married, not their achievements. Politics is often a family business in Latin America, too. The current governor of the state of Mexico is the son of a governor and the grandson of a governor. His distant cousin is former President Enrique Peña Nieto. Around the region, family-run companies are still the norm, in many cases protected from outside competition by pals in politics. There are public policies that encourage and keep this status quo. The rich in Mexico are much more able to pass on their wealth from generation to generation than in the US. Mexico has no real inheritance taxes, very low capital gains taxes, and low property taxes. Instead, it relies on sales taxes for much of its income, which hits the poor disproportionately hard. Crucially, inequality also fosters political instability. What happens in a society when the poor or middle class feel they can't get ahead? History is full of examples of inequality creating instability. To this day, Haiti is not recovered from the slave revolt that gave it independence at the cost of destroying the economy. The late 19th century and early 20th century dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico started modernizing the country, but inequality skyrocketed. It was followed by the chaos of what Mexicans call the revolution, but which was really a civil war between competing strongmen that killed 1 million people. I had a journalist friend in Bolivia who once told me about covering 3 military coups, all in the same week. After the recent tax cuts under the Trump administration, a British historian, Dan Snow, tweeted, "Why do so many ultra-rich Americans seek to destroy the economic and political consensus that has delivered them such extraordinary wealth, stability, and legitimacy?" Inequality also radicalizes politics. Voters who are frustrated at their lack of economic progress start looking for answers, and they start believing in politicians who come along and offer easy answers and someone to blame for their problems. For too many decades, Latin American politics has veered dangerously from right to left and back again. When you have legions of poor, it's fertile ground for communists and socialists and grand experiments that very often don't work. These in turn prompt a backlash for right-wing hardliners like the military. Between 1962 and 1966, there were 9 coups in Latin America, nearly all against governments the military feared were becoming communist. Too often in Latin America, politics has been a choice between Che and Pinochet. The results of this radicalism have been horrific. Cuba impoverished by communism, tens of thousands of people killed in military dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil. As politics gets more polarized, it's also fertile ground for the growth of populism. Populism has lots of definitions. My definition is that it's a situation in which a charismatic leader convinces a large segment of the population that the system is rigged against them and that he is their answer. For Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was poor because the rich were stealing their oil money and kowtowing to the Americans. For Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Mexico is poor because of a mafia of power between the rich and corrupt politicians. In reading about growing inequality in the US, for years, I've been expecting what some might call the Latin Americanization of American politics. I thought sooner or later we were going to see a Chavez-type populist in the US. Really, I was thinking about left-wing populism. The rich are eating our lunch. It's the fault of the corporations against the little man. In some ways, Bernie Sanders and AOC are the expected result of growing inequality in politics. What took me totally by surprise was the rise of right-wing populism in the US. If left-wing populism blames the rich and imperialists for people's problems, the right-wing version tends to look to immigrants and elites, be they globalization advocates or Jews, to blame. Candidate Trump first announced he was running in a speech where he said Mexico was a big problem for the US. It was sending rapists across the border and it was stealing US jobs. And China too, and global trade, and the Muslims, and the so-called urban elites in the US that promoted these agendas. This resonated with lots of working class white folks who are having a tougher time economically and want some answers. Now, I'm here as David Luhnow, not as a representative of the Wall Street Journal, so these are my opinions, not the papers. One can argue whether Trump has delivered for these people. He did go after what he and many thought were unfair trade practices by China, but did little to promote worker retraining initiatives for those dislocated by trade in the Rust Belt, for instance. His tax cuts went disproportionately to the rich, and he seemed mostly happy to defend the working class through rhetoric and culture wars rather than through things like healthcare and education. But that judgment is quite frankly above my pay grade and one more for the history books. What I can say in my experience is that there's a direct line between inequality, populism, and polarization. The more divided a country gets economically, the more divided it becomes politically. Now, I've worried a lot about the growing Latin Americanization of American politics. And now we have elections where the loser cries fraud and refuses to accept the results. A good percentage of the American public will believe this and start to question our own institutions. We've seen this in Mexico. AMLO didn't recognize the 2006 election, which he also claimed without evidence were fraudulent. Only in this case, AMLO was not the sitting president, but that didn't stop him from declaring himself the legitimate president and holding a mock swearing-in ceremony. So from inequality, and I'll go a little bit faster from now, guys, we go to institutions. In this book, The Why Nations Fail, the authors start the book by looking at Nogales, Sinaloa, and Nogales, Arizona. Same city, same valley, same rainfall, same culture, basically same racial composition. So why are both sides so different? The answer they come up with, and one that I find very convincing, is institutions. Given the very different beginnings to the colonial experiences in the US and Canada from Latin America, both sides created very different institutions. In the US, mostly in the North and less so in the South, institutions became inclusive institutions. In Mexico and most of Latin America, the institutions are what the authors call extractive institutions, aimed solely at helping the elites maintain their advantages over the poor. What kind of culture and institutions grow up in a place where the main source of wealth is an extractive industry like mining, where you have the owner at the top and a vast army of workers digging out below, or where you have vast plantations like cotton in the South, or like sugar in Mexico, Cuba, and Brazil? With power and wealth concentrated in few hands, Latin America never bothered to create the kinds of institutions like judicial institutions and rule of law to protect ordinary citizens. Why not? Well, if you're a rich guy in Mexico and you're exploiting your workers, you want justice you can buy. And if you're a powerful politician, you want justice that you can use selectively to help friends and punish enemies. Peruvian President Oscar Benavides once famously said, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law." When you grow up in a country like Mexico, you learn that Mexico's independence movement was a glorious insurrection against a dastardly Spanish crown. When you get a bit older and learn a bit more about history, the picture gets complicated. How did Mexico's independence movement start? Because Napoleon's invasion of Spain had led to reforms in the Cortes de Cádiz. They were aimed at implementing some of the ideals of the Enlightenment to Spain, including equal protection under the law. But elites in Mexico were against those reforms and took advantage of the chaos in Spain to ensure that those reforms wouldn't prosper in Mexico. It's no accident that the first leader of an independent Mexico was an emperor, Agustín de Iturbide. Time and again, Mexico failed to create institutions that helped ordinary people. In the US, the Homestead Act of 1862 and others handed out land, albeit taken from the Indians, on an equal basis to people, creating an economically dynamic frontier. In Mexico, only the politically connected got land, making them even more powerful. Consider banking. In the early years of US independence, politicians tried to set up state banking monopolies, which they could give to their friends who would give their politician buddies cut-rate loans to help them get rich too. It's just the kind of arrangement that arose in Mexico. But because those politicians in the US were subject to election, those who did this kind of thing lost and ultimately failed in setting up a system of monopolistic banking. So an inclusive political institution, elections, created a dynamic banking sector. By 1914, there were 27,800 banks in the US. In Mexico, there were 42, and 2 controlled over half of all the banking system's assets. Now, it's sometimes fashionable in the US to bash government as this big drain on society. And government that gets too big is a problem. I've seen that in Brazil. But most of us grow up not questioning that our government worked in the US. Think about what life is like when there is no real rule of law, no real authority to arbiter disputes or protect property rights. Imagine you're my friend Toño, who was crossing the street one day in Mexico City and who got grabbed from behind by 2 cops and thrown in jail. Toño had no idea why he was in jail. After a few days, he was told he was in there for murdering somebody he never met. There was no evidence against him. He had a stall in a street market, and lots of people testified that he was there at the supposed time of the murder. But he was convicted to 20 years. Why? The initial suspect, a gang member, appears to have been friendly with the cops. Maybe they had corrupt dealings with the guy. But whatever the reason, they decided to go after Toño instead. So they convinced the initial suspect to blame Toño. Despite the fact there was no scientific evidence and he had an alibi, he was sentenced on eyewitness testimony. 95% of convictions in Mexico have 0 scientific evidence. As a result, just 2% of Mexicans and Brazilians have a lot of faith in their judicial systems. When you don't trust the institutions in your society, the only people you end up trusting is your family. There is no concept of the greater good, the social compact. When someone gets behind the wheel to drive in Mexico, it's every person for themselves. The old saying, el que no tranza, no avanza. Literally, he that doesn't cheat doesn't get ahead. Latin America's rich give far less than other rich people on the planet. One reason is the lack of trust. They don't trust the charities to spend the money well and not pocket it. It's a reason the national sport is often tax evasion. If you think your government is going to steal the money, why pay taxes? Low taxes then means less money to pay for things like good schools and professional cops. So what happens when you have unequal societies with weak institutions? Sooner or later, along comes the guy on horseback and says, I am the answer. Chavez used to say all the time that he was the one that would redeem poor Venezuelans. AMLO says he's the savior of the country. And Trump said, quote, he alone can fix it. That doesn't leave a lot of room for institutions. Institutions are the answer, not individual politicians. So when I see politicians in Mexico and Brazil and in the US attacking the Department of Justice for not going after their rivals or attacking the free media, that's a big red flag. So the last two I's very quickly: impunity and insecurity. Mexican politicians steal because they won't get caught, or at least very often, unless they steal so much that something has to be done. Javier Duarte, the former governor of Veracruz state, made off with an estimated $3 billion. Until recently, Brazilian politicians felt they could steal without getting caught. Now, as much as half of the country's Congress is under investigation. In Peru, 68 of 130 congressmen face criminal charges, ranging from embezzlement to murder. So what did they do? They impeached the president last week, and the head of Congress took power. There are other kinds of impunity. If you commit murder in Mexico, as we all know, you have a 98% chance of getting away with it. Why? Because the police and judicial system are too weak and underfunded to do their jobs right. The lack of good institutions and impunity is a big reason why Latin America struggles with the last I in security. Simply put, Latin America is the most dangerous part of the world, and it's not even close. Latin America has 7% of the world's population and 36% of global murders. Just 4 countries, Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and Colombia, account for 1 in every 4 murders in the world. Anyhow, I hope this has been a bit helpful in explaining why Latin America never achieved the kind of progress managed by the US and Europe. I also hope some of you can see better the importance of building strong and inclusive institutions that create the right incentives for people. As I've seen from nearly 30 years in Latin America, these institutions are terrifically hard to build. They take a generation, and they're very easy to destroy. Here in Mexico right now, I think we have a president that's setting about tearing apart some of these institutions that have taken a while to build, and not caring about building other institutions, seeing himself as the answer. So with that, I'll wrap up, turn it back to you guys and see if you guys have any questions or any comments.
Wow, thank you, David. That was very interesting, and it makes you think a lot, you know, and it gives us a lot of pause to think about what's going on in all the countries and the similarities and differences as to what rhetoric does. So I'd like to open it up to questions. We have a few minutes. David has been kind enough to answer. So go ahead and unmute yourself. I've muted everyone as the conference went along. So if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please go ahead. Let me unmute everyone. Hang on.
Mine is not so much a question, David. I want to say hi. I probably met you in early 90s. I assume you went with your dad occasionally to Union Church. And
That's
you
right.
need to say hi to Chris for me, please, your dad. It's really, really, very, very interesting. I thought you put a wonderful perspective on this. Without getting into the politics, you share, I just know that much of us agree with so much of what you said. So I think it was really wonderful. And I think it was just a terrific presentation. It's one of the best ones we've had. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I don't know if you remember me, but
I
remember,
do.
yes, I remember you. I don't know how old you are now, but you were just a young kid back then.
I'm 52 years young.
Okay, so you were probably in your 20s, yeah.
Yeah, no, I always remember your name, Bill, and I know that Dad. I think both at the Union Church, we used to see you there all the time.
Yeah. Good, really
So,
good
yeah.
to see you again.
Likewise.
Great presentation.
I appreciate that.
David, Doug Clark here in Tepoztlan. I sat through an hour-long presentation yesterday by the 4 members of The Economist. And it was mostly about the new president and what the future holds. I found it to be very depressing. And they were talking about all the limitations and all the problems that are the country's facing right now. But from the Mexico-US perspective, what do you see coming forth possibly coming forth from a Biden presidency? Do you think there's going to be a more warm relations, better opportunities? What do you think?
Well, it's been fascinating to watch. When AMLO was elected, everyone predicted that he and Trump were going to, practically end up pistols at dawn. And it turned out, lo and behold, that these two guys got along really well. And I think the reason is because they're so similar. Beyond sort of differences in some policies, their styles and the way they do politics are very similar. And I think they recognize that in each other. They both view each other as outsider politicians who took on a corrupt establishment and won. They've managed to create this sort of working relationship on a one-to-one level that sort of superimposed itself on the traditional institutional relationship that the countries normally had. Now everything goes through sort of Trump to AMLO, as opposed to the State Department dealing with the Mexican SRE and the DEA working with Mexican security forces. It's all very much at that level. Now, it worked very well for Trump because AMLO agreed to essentially put the National Guard in Mexico as the stopgap for migration. And I think Biden's going to probably try to return the relationship back to that more institutional level. I see early on, and this is a story we're actually working on, I think one of the first big crises that Biden's going to face is going to be immigration. In Central America, you've not only had these economies hit by COVID, you've had them now hit by a hurricane. There's another hurricane heading their way next week. The governance in these places is terrible. So all of those push factors in migration have only gotten worse. And they may see that the coyote smugglers are very clever. They're going to see there's a new administration, there's a new sheriff with the gringos. So let's give that a try. So I think you're going to see these big caravans of migrants testing the new US administration almost right away. And it's not going to be easy for a Biden team. Trump was right when he said that there were things broken in the immigration system. It was one of those things you learn as a reporter. When Trump first came to power and he was talking about illegal immigration, I thought, well, wait a minute, the numbers of immigrants from Mexico to the US have plunged dramatically. It's a tenth of what it was in the early 2000s. So what's this guy talking about? But then we started seeing these migrant families from Central America going up. And the closer we looked, the more we thought, geez, he's got a point about the immigration system being broken. What was happening is that these Central American families, urged on by the polleros, the smugglers, were going en masse to the border and claiming asylum. Help, help, we're being repressed. You need to give us asylum. And because they were claiming asylum under international law, the US was taking them in. In some cases, the case was taking 4 to 5 years to be adjudicated as to whether or not these people really were fleeing from targeted violence of a political nature or others. In the meantime, they were free to work and made money. So even if they did eventually get kicked out by the immigration system, they made enough work to have made the trip worthwhile. So there was no deterrent for the US to stop these families from coming. And so it just sort of, when you start to look at it, you realize, okay, Trump did these things, I think, in a very heavy and in some cases, some would argue, immoral way. I mean, the separating of families, the remaining in Mexico, these were very draconian policies. But the Biden team is going to have a tough time in figuring out how to fix what was broken while putting sort of a kindler, gentler face to some of those policies that nobody likes. I mean, nobody wants to see families being torn apart. There's 600 and something kids that the US government lost track of their families and they can't be reunited. I mean, those stories are really, heartrending and unacceptable. So hopefully they can figure out a way, but they can't just, go back to what was there before. They're going to have to take some hard decisions as to how to do this. And they're going to have a pretty radical left-wing base of the Democrats saying, no, you got to let everybody in. So it's going to be interesting to see how Biden handles that.
Hola, ahí te mandé el.
All right. So on this same line of questions, we have a question from Lynn David that said, what's your perspective of AMLO not yet acknowledging the election of Biden as the next US president?
Well, again, I think they are both Trump and AMLO and Bolsonaro. It's interesting when you look at the list, the rather small list of world leaders who have not recognized Biden. It is Putin in Russia, Xi in China, Kim Jong-un in South Korea, and AMLO in Mexico and Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's pretty much it of countries of note. Those leaders all have something in common. They're all, authoritarian or authoritarian populists. So they don't really care about institutions like the elections. AMLO comes from a 2006 process. I mean, I spoke to somebody from, I spoke to our Washington reporter yesterday who covered the Biden campaign, and she said that at first they were really sort of taken aback as to why AMLO was refusing to congratulate Biden. But then the Mexican team explained that, you see, AMLO had this situation in 2006 where he narrowly lost an election. And he's very concerned about, he was very upset at the time that foreign leaders congratulated Calderon without waiting for the legal process in Mexico to work itself out. So he feels that he should wait until the legal process in the US works itself out. Well, okay, although, when it came to Bolivia's election last year that Evo Morales essentially stole, AMLO was very quick to offer him congratulations. So he thinks he doth protest a bit too much. And when you go back and you look at that 2006 experience, it's almost exactly what I mean when I talk about institutions and how that's really Mexico's big challenge. We all grew up, or we all remember a Mexico where the PRI, would resort to its, Operation Tamale. You get a bunch of ballots and you stuff them in the box, and these kinds of things. Operación Carusel, where they would take voters to go around different voting booths and vote multiple times. These were all a part of how Mexican elections worked. But after the 1988 election, Mexico got serious about reforming the process, and the process of reform was led by the left in Mexico. They eventually came up with an independent electoral agency, the INE, that organizes a very good, and I would say transparent, election process. And what the 2006 election was really all about is AMLO saying that institution doesn't work because it's in the service of the rich and we should ignore it. And at one point he famously said, "Al diablo con tus instituciones," to hell with your institutions. But really, the INE had done a great job and should have been recognized as such, and ultimately the institution did hold. Mexico has built some other good institutions. The central bank has been independent and has kept Mexico's monetary stability in check for many years. Mexico built a world-class bench of financial technocrats who have basically managed the economy to an incredible degree over the last 30 years and kept things stable that it didn't have. What it's failed to do is sort of transfer that sort of institution building away from just keeping Mexico's finances stable and holding good elections to areas like security, like rule of law, like the police, things like that. And that's, I think, Mexico's big unfinished challenge. Anti-corruption. I mean, the answer to corruption is not the man on top who's clean, that barrer las escaleras de arriba hacia abajo, as AMLO says. It's having good, independent anti-corruption prosecutors who are funded, who have a good team that can go after the bad guys, catch them, convict them, and lock them up. Once that happens in Mexico, you will see things start to change with corruption. But instead, AMLO has cut the funding for those kinds of agencies and ignored the creation of independent anti-corruption prosecutors. The reason Brazil had the big Lava Jato anti-corruption scandal was because 10 years before, they had created independent anti-corruption prosecutors. I've met some of them. These are incredibly well-educated guys. They all went to Harvard. They went to the very top universities in the world. They have good salaries. They're in their positions. They can't be fired for political reasons. They even get their wardrobes paid for. And they have their children's private schools paid for by the government to ensure that they don't succumb to temptation, to corruption. Mexico has utterly failed to build these kinds of institutions. And when AMLO says that corruption in Mexico has ended, my bet is it very much hasn't. So that's a long-winded explanation of sort of, AMLO and Trump, put less value on institutions. They both see institutions as a roadblock rather than as something to be built up. Trump is the first president in my lifetime to question the legitimacy of institutions that organize elections, for example. Now, AMLO gets that. Putin loves it. She loves it because they delegitimize the American democratic process to their populations. But I find it quite shocking. Apparently, there is a precedent for this. John Adams didn't go to Thomas Jefferson's inauguration 200 and some odd years ago because he said there was fraud. But it's been a while.
Oh, yes.
Hey, David, I just have a question. You know, as Mexico, there's a lot of question as to how Biden is going to relate with AMLO, seeing as how when AMLO went to the state visit in Washington in July, he didn't even bother to call Biden. So anyway, I look at that, and then to see that the bond rating for Mexico now is 3B minus. And with the midterm elections coming up next June in Mexico, what do you think might result as the ambassador, assuming that Biden will change the current ambassador? And what perspectives do you think this has for the Mexican economy over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, those are good questions. The Biden team is going to put a little more emphasis on areas. I mean, the Trump relationship with Mexico became centered around the single issue of immigration. So AMLO did a good job on migration. All else is sort of forgiven. It's a similar dynamic and very interesting in Honduras, where the president, his brother is a convicted narco trafficker, Tony Hernandez, and the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. There is so much smoke, you can't even sort of see the fire in relation to organized crime and drug trafficking. Yet, the US government has sort of accepted Hernandez and given him their backing because he's good on immigration. So that kind of thing, I think, is going to become, is over. I think the US is going to go back to caring about things like corruption, to caring about development. I mean, I think for migration, I think both Biden and AMLO could see some common ground in trying to stop the push factors of migration, things like economic development initiatives in Central America. They might be able to see some common ground on that. But Biden's going to be much more, the Biden team and the Americans in general will be more interested in things like institutions in Mexico. When AMLO attacks the press, that may not go unnoticed. When there's any kind of democratic backsliding in Mexico, the killing of journalists, things like this, the US is going to take a more active role probably in protesting these things again. And that's going to be uncomfortable for AMLO. He's not necessarily going to want that. I think on the trade front, it'll be interesting to see what Biden does. And I have no idea what he's going to do. I mean, Trump obviously made trade and going against global trade one of his sort of calling cards. I think he was persuaded by the US business community that ending NAFTA was not a good idea. There's a huge opportunity for both countries right now to turn Mexico into the global manufacturing alternative to China. It would help the US enormously because 30 to 35 cents of everything that Mexico exports to the US actually originates in the US. So there's a lot of ties. I think it's comfortable for US corporations to be based in Mexico. It's the same time zone, similar culture. It's just an easier operating environment. So there's a huge opportunity right now for the US and Mexico together to become more competitive in the global marketplace and really provide an alternative to China. But that's going to depend on both the vision and leadership in the US and in Mexico. And I think AMLO, up to this point, has shown no interest in understanding those kinds of global trends. I think his view of the economy tends to be sort of the view that he grew up with in Tabasco in the 1970s, where Pemex and the state-run companies were a big deal. And that's how he kind of views where Mexico's economy needs to be. So I think there's a bit of a lost opportunity there that hopefully, AMLO's successor will spot and work with the US in sort of helping that happen. I think to make that happen, Mexico needs to become a place where the rule of law is more important. Zedillo was once asked what are Mexico's main challenges. And there are three: rule of law, and rule of law. And I think if you're an American investor and you want to bring a factory down to Mexico, you want rule of law. You don't want to have to pay bribes to some drug cartel or to some politician. And if Mexico can sort of create that, then I think Mexico becomes the Latin tiger that we've always hoped it would become. But that's a big if. And right now they're not taking steps to change that.
Do you think, David, that the composition of the Senate, because that's still up in the air, will change that, whether it goes one way or the other, depending on where the balance lies? Will that make a difference into the trade arrangements or trade deals that can be done with Mexico? And will the Mexican trade agreement that is in place now continue?
Yeah, I think the USMCA, I mean, by all accounts, they sort of put lipstick on NAFTA and dolled it up a little bit, but it's basically the same agreement with a few changes. It does give the US more of a right to intrude in Mexico's labor law and ensure that Mexico's labor law is being enforced, which is a very interesting sort of outcome. I mean, you could have American unions coming down to Mexico and saying, hey, these Mexicans are getting underpaid, they're being unfairly treated, and we're going to court to say that this investment is illegal. And under the new USMCA, they can do that. So Trump, that was a pretty big win for Trump. And that's actually a pretty big win for some of these, blue collar workers in the Rust Belt and places like that. It's no accident that things were so close in places like Erie, Pennsylvania, and in Dayton, Ohio, and these kinds of places where these workers feel they've been hard done by globalization and haven't had a champion. So it's going to be interesting. I think no matter who's in power, what happens to the US consensus on free trade? Trump was the first guy to come and break that consensus. I don't know if the remaining Republicans agree with him or are just going along, and where the Democrats stand. Are they both going to go to the left and become more pro-union, or are they both going to continue to defend free trade? I think it's an open question.
We have a question also from Doug Hall. He'd like to ask you what your impression of AMLO's handling of the COVID pandemic, and how the Biden administration might alter that.
Well, once again, this would be a personal opinion and not on behalf of the Wall Street Journal. I'm doing a story now that I've sent up to New York about what we call excess deaths in the pandemic. There's the official tally of COVID deaths in most countries, but to get a better idea of just how many people have died due to the pandemic, whether they're COVID deaths that the government isn't picking up or other deaths due to things like people putting off treatment for their chronic illnesses or hospitals not having the bandwidth to deal with other kinds of patients. So the best thing to do is sort of look at the average deaths in previous years compared to the overall deaths this year. And what we see in Mexico is that it's about 2.5 times the official COVID count pretty consistently. So Mexico now has just short of 100,000 COVID deaths. The real toll from the pandemic in Mexico is about 250,000 dead. That gap between the official COVID dead and the excess deaths is far bigger in Mexico than in most other countries. And it comes down to how the Mexican government has been counting cases and deaths. Put simply, they have done the least testing of any major country in the world. They made it very difficult to get a test. They do not count the private lab tests that come through. They only count tests that have been sent to the INDRE, their one official government lab, to be counted. You are not counted as dead unless you have a COVID test. There are many, many people in Mexico who have died in their homes. The more I've looked into this, the more shocked I've become at how widespread the mistrust is among poor Mexicans of the public hospital system. Again, you have sort of this lack of trust in your institutions. So Mexicans would prefer to fight COVID at home rather than go to the IMSS, which they see as a death sentence. And in part, they're right. I mean, half of all COVID patients have died in Mexican hospitals, but it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. The people are staying at home for so long that they're only going to the public hospitals when they're already seriously ill. And so there's less that can be done for them. And then, then of course their relative dies and they tell all the neighbors, ay, pues no pase lo que pase, no te vayas al IMSS porque no sales, and so that's what they tell their neighbors. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. I think certainly Mexico took an approach that some would argue was an intentional downplaying of both cases and deaths in order to diminish the magnitude of the problem. We had a president here that, like other populists in the world, ignored the science, didn't think masks were good, told people to keep going out, thought it was like a flu. And well, it turned out they were wrong. It's not like the flu, it's something new. Masks, it turns out, are a hugely important part of controlling this. To this day, AMLO's worn a mask once when he was on a flight to the US, when he was going to go visit Trump. And they've sort of intentionally downplayed that. So there was no effort at contact tracing. There was no effort at widespread testing. As one epidemiologist told me, if you're not doing the testing, then you're flying blind. You don't have the information about where there are outbreaks. You're not able to have local authorities go in and do contact tracing, control outbreaks, do the actual rastreo that you need. One of the stories I did in the pandemic was about the Central de Abastos, where the city government of Mexico City did a much better job than the federal government. Sheinbaum's government went into the Central de Abastos. They implemented a testing and tracing system where they controlled outbreaks quickly. And I think they did a very, very effective job at turning things around in a place that could have absolutely unleashed just a tidal wave of cases on Mexico City. So I think it was an effort that saved a lot of lives. And to me, it really showed kind of the operational differences between the Mexico City government and a potential successor to AMLO and the federal government.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Elena.
Hello, David. I was a friend of your parents since the 70s, Chris and Bobby. I'm so proud to see you so many years later heading us with the Wall Street Journal and an expert on Latin America. Your comments today, as Bill said a while ago, are excellent. You really educated me today on some things I hadn't thought about historically and currently. When I was at the University of Texas at El Paso in the early 1990s, I was heavily involved with NAFTA. So of course, I'm very interested in everything you've said right now about TEMEC and the tweaks and cutting and arranging they've had. I personally would hope that it continues, because the relationship Canada, United States, Mexico, I think is vitally important. Yes, we dealt with the people in the sindicatos, the unions, the American Union, and I was a moderator of some presentations there. I'm a political science student at the time, so you can imagine what I was involved in. So thank you for these comments today. I think they're very enlightening. So more than another question, because I know your time's up, I just wanted to congratulate you and thank everybody at the ABS for having brought this, you may say, meeting or a presentation with you today. My blessings.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
And you also have a congratulations message here from Tere Aguilar David. She'd like to congratulate you for such an eye-opening conference as well. And does anyone have any other question or comment?
I just want to tell David that, like always, I'm really proud of him. He's a great member of the community and one of our shining stars. Thanks a lot, David, for giving us that great talk.
Thank you, Francis.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to, on behalf of the ABS, thank you, David, so much for your time, for such an interesting, conversation to have on Mexico. For some of us, Mexico is our home, our birth home. For many others, it is your adopted home, but we've been here for so long. So it's really fantastic to be able to get such an insight into what is happening right here. We hear so much, we're always tuned into the news with the 24-hour news cycle going on, but it is a different perspective. So I truly appreciate it, and I thank you for your time. And I thank I thank everyone for being here, for taking the time. As you know, the ABS is here. Our mission is to help Americans here in Mexico. And this is part of what we've been doing. When the pandemic hit, we found a way to get everyone together, to be able to see each other. And even if it's virtual through a screen, it is wonderful to see so many of you, to stay involved. I thank you. If you're not a member of the ABS, we urge you to become a member, to help us out, to help us continue the work that we've been doing, as Barbara said, for over 150 years. And thank you to David. Really, it was fantastic. I truly appreciate it. And you're getting a virtual hand of applause.
Say.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, guys.
Bravo, David.
Very
Come back to see us.
We'll come back. We'll do an update.
Please.
Definitely. Thank
Best
you.
wishes and many happy returns.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, David. And definitely, I think after January 20th, we'll have a different perspective, and it will be very interesting to talk to David again and see, what will happen then exactly. Well, maybe not January, but February, March, we'll talk and see what's going on and how you view things. And hopefully, as you say, this will battle a bit of the inequality that is so prevalent in our country.
He reminded me of Distant Neighbors.
Yes.
See, great book.
Yes.
Exactly.
I was
all right.
David, that
Yes.
was just really fantastic. Thank you. I'm kind of like speechless, and I can't wait to hear it all again.
Thank you, Gwen. And your brother and I play tennis sometimes at the Mundet. I'm a huge fan of Carl. I think he's a wonderful guy, and these are themes I know that are near and dear to his heart as well.
Oh,
so
yes.
We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I know I've seen you at some of all kinds of events. So great to hear you. Wow. Thank you. Bless you tons. I'll tell
great
Thank
opportunity.
Great, guys. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to everyone. And
Goodbye.
Our
Thank
best
you,
to
David.
all your families.
Thank you, David.
And thank you. And
Thank you.
for those of you who are still here, remember we have our modified health day this Tuesday. We will have the pneumonia and shingles vaccines available by appointment only. We still have a couple of slots if you'd like to contact Mario if you haven't gotten your appointment yet. And thank you.
Klaus,
And we will
have you,
see you
Klaus,
in
have you
December.
ever read the biography of Alexander von Humboldt?
Yes, I did.
The Invention of Nature. I loved it. I
Yeah,
thought it
of
was
course.
very
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
He was a great man.
Fantastic.
All his travels and discoveries.
Amazing.
And
yes.
Right about Mexico, fabulous at the
Yes.
time, and even up to date. Many are valid.
David,
Thanks,
what
guys.
I most loved that you said is something that's always been in my heart. As an American raised in Mexico, and Carl, and my father, we're passionate and we love Mexico so much, and it has such potential. So the most beautiful thing you said is this is actually an opportunity for Mexico to work with the United States and for Mexico to become what it could be.
Yeah.
Amen to that.
Yes. Yes.
The same with my family, my mother's family, the Riders.